people will have to press their okay with it. So press the got it or the leave meeting. Hopefully no one will leave the meeting. So you'll have that little box come up on your screen. So as I say, the session is being recorded. Now, because of the number of people that we're going to have in the session, we think the best way to take questions is to use the chat box. Now, most people are going to be familiar with Zoom. If you're not, if you look generally down the bottom, you can move the bar around, but generally it's the bottom. You'll see a little chat icon. If you press on that, you'll be able to type in a question. That can be directed to everybody. Or if you go to the participants and you see someone that you know, and throughout the webinar, if you want to have a private chat with them, you can single them out, and then only those people or that person that you have directed the chat to will be involved. So either do a private chat, or if you're going to ask a general question, do a general question chat to everybody, and Paul or myself will collate those and we'll go through those at the end of this webinar. So maybe an introduction to Ecoinsects. It began with Paul and myself, who were part of the Dung Beetle Ecosystem Engineers project that ran from 2018 through to 2022. Rob Young, who's pictured up there, was part of the Queensland Smart Farms Dung Beetle project, and that was from 2021 to 2022. So we've all got a background in dung beetles and we're passionate about it. Through our engagement with producers and land managers over this time, we all saw that there was a need to continue the research, extension, and the distribution of dung beetles after both of these projects had finished. And through that recognition, Ecoinsects was born. Our aim there is to continue to support the dissemination of information of dung beetles, and that's why we're here this evening. And basically to help you get the best ecosystem services from dung beetles that are possible. And hopefully when you think of dung beetles, going into the future, you'll think Ecoinsects. So I'm pictured up there on the left. That was during COVID. Didn't have to shave during COVID. You got Paul. He didn't have to shave during COVID, and Rob obviously saw better of it and did.
Still haven't shaved.
Still haven't shaved. All right, so I'd like to give a bit of a roadmap of where we're going to go. There were some pointers up on the webinar invitation and the fact that we were doing this, but I've gone through a few of the comments and pulled out people's names and some of the comments that I've attributed to them in the Facebook pages. So Carolyn has said, someone's not on mute. Carolyn's mentioned that she's interested, but not new to, doesn't know much about dung beetles. And then we've got Ju, who wants to know the benefits of beetles and how to care for them. Janine wants to know about native versus introduced species. Can they coexist? Beetles for different soils, climates, and dung. Kelly. Julie wants to know about parasite management and dung beetles. Tanya, how do we breed them on our farm? Amber, where have they disappeared to? So I'd suggest Amber has had them at one stage, but can no longer find them, and we'll discuss that. Scott has said he's seeing dung beetle activity, but only after removing all chemicals. And I think from memory, he said he's been on the farm for 4 years, and now he's just starting to see dung beetles return. We'll talk about that. And Jessica wants to know how to identify dung beetles. So hopefully by the end of the session this evening, we'll have addressed all of those questions and you'll be wiser for it. So let's start off by asking what a dung beetle is. And it's much nicer when you're actually in a room doing this and you can single people out and ask them questions in particular. But the way that scientists classify all living things is with a hierarchy. And at the very top, we're incredibly broad. And as we move down that ladder, we're becoming much more specific. For example, the kingdoms we'll all know about animals, plants, fungi, and we can go on. Classifications are sometimes broken into 5, 6, 7, or 8 kingdoms, depending on which book you want to read. So let's just be satisfied with the fact that at the very broadest classification, we've got animals, plants, and fungi. Well, dung beetles are animals. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. We can then break that down, and they belong to a phylum called Arthropoda. This is about as sciencey as we're going to make it. We're not going to get too bogged down in the science, but it's good to think about what a dung beetle is through that scientific classification. So if you look at the examples of Arthropoda there, yabbies, scorpions, spiders, centipedes, flies, and beetles, they've all got one thing in common, and that is they've got jointed legs or jointed feet, and that Arthropoda simply means that. If we see that beetles are arthropods, then we can further classify them, and we say, well, they're also insects. And so insects have 6 legs. All right, let's go down one further. How do flies differ from beetles? Beetles all have wings that are covered by a shield. And you've got 2 pictures of beetles up on the screen in front of you. And what you'll see are these shields covering their wings. And Coleoptera simply means shielded wings. So we can further classify beetles into ladybirds, weevils, or scarabs. Scarabs then belong to a family called Scarabaeidae, which constitute the vast majority of dung beetles, and in fact involve around about 30,000 species of beetles across the world. There's about 8,000 species of dung beetles. So people often say scarab beetles look like Christmas beetles, or Christmas beetles look like scarabs. They are. Dung beetles are also scarabs. So don't be surprised when you see a Christmas beetle looking very much like some of your dung beetles. So how do we classify those 2 beetles as different? Well, dung beetles, and this is how we specify a dung beetle, it involves dung. It eats dung both as the adult and the larval stages. So what we call true dung beetles have a total reliance on dung at all stages of their life cycle. In contrast, your Christmas beetle, the Anoplognathus chloropyrus, which is the genus and the species of that particular beetle, it relies on eating eucalyptus leaves as the adult, and it eats roots as a larval stage down under the ground. So we can go further down and classify our beetles to species levels, and it's that 2 words which are always in italics which specify a species. And in that particular case, the dung beetle that you've got in front of you is a beetle called Ornithophagus binotus. So that's technically what a dung beetle is. It's simply a beetle, which is an insect, which is an arthropod, which belongs to all the animals that eats dung. So I mentioned on the previous slide that dung beetles use dung at all stages of their life. You've got the top of the life cycle there with the adult, and the adult is actually not eating solid parts of the dung. It's filter feeding on the dung, and it's drinking the juices of the dung. But it then creates a dung mass in which it lays an egg. And you can see in the top left-hand picture there, you've got a dung mass, and in there an egg is laid. That egg hatches to form a larva. The larva then grows. So it goes through 3 sheddings of its skin, and that's what we call the instars. So it goes through a first, second, and third stage larva, where each stage it grows and sheds its skin before it undergoes metamorphosis, just like your caterpillar grows and grows and grows, goes into a cocoon, undergoes metamorphosis, and then eventually it will emerge as the adult beetle. It's important to point this out here because dung beetles, as they emerge, are already adults. They don't grow. There's no such thing as a baby beetle. The baby beetle is the larva that lives under the ground. So people will see a range of sizes of dung beetles, albeit the same species. They'll have a smaller member and a larger member. What constitutes whether it's a big or a small beetle is the dung quantity and the dung quality that it had available to it as it was a larvae eating its way through that dung packet, which was all under the ground. You can see a picture or an image of a larvae inside a dung ball there, and it just eats that and grows and grows and grows. There is no damage to any plants through dung beetles because everything they need is encased in that dung ball. If we further want to classify our dung beetles, we've got 3 types of dung beetles. We've got what we call dwellers, and if you go out to your dung pats tomorrow morning and have a poke through it, there's a good chance that you're going to find this small, it's about 1 centimetre long, black and orange beetle called a Phodius vimitarius. It's what we call a dung dwelling beetle. It lives in the dung pat or the dung pellets on top of the ground, but it doesn't tunnel. It doesn't make balls of dung and roll them away. It just does its ecosystem services living in the dung. We've then also got what we call rollers, and they're the classic ones you see on the David Attenborough documentaries, and they fashion a ball of dung. Then they roll that ball of dung away from the dung pat. It stops competition, lay an egg in the dung pat or the dung ball, and they either put it into the foliage. And if we have a look up in here, if you can see my mouse moving on the screen, you can see dung balls. They're being deposited in grass. Some of them are buried slightly, so maybe a few centimetres under the ground. Some of them are up to 5 or 10 centimetres under the ground. So they don't tunnel as such, but they do sometimes bury their dung balls, depending on the species of dung rolling beetle that we're dealing with. And the third and most important for us is the tunneler. And I say they're the most important because they give the greatest ecosystem services to the producer. They take the dung, dig tunnels up to 1 metre in depth, and then through that tunnelling, that allows the air and the water to penetrate, and the nutrients are cycled down into the ground, and also the nutrients that are locked up in the soil are brought to the surface. So it's the tunnelers which we're particularly interested in at Ecoinsects. We often get the question, how long is a life cycle? And that really does depend. It depends on the species. So for example, if we go and look at our color wheel over here, this is just a seasonal chart, which you'll be able to download from the Ecoinsects website. You can see a beetle here down in winter in Buba's bison as its name. Its life cycle can be up to 3 years. It will lay an egg. It can spend 1-2 years in the ground and then eventually undergo pupation and emerge as an adult beetle. If we contrast that with this beetle over here in spring, this one's called Ornithophagus vacca, and its life cycle is typically 12 months. And that's more common for most of the beetles that we're dealing with. Commonly, they have a 12-month life cycle. So for example, Ornithophagus vacca would emerge as an adult from spending its winter in the ground in spring. We see them coming up now in our breeding facilities. And Ornithophagus vacca then has 2 generations of beetles in the 1 year, and that's what we call voltinism. It's the breeding frequency. So if a beetle has 2 generations in a year, it's called bivoltine. If it has 1 generation in a year, it's called univoltine. And then we have what we call multivoltine, where they can have 3, 4 or more generations in a year. But 1 and 2 are the most common ones. So back to our Ornithophagus vacca, it would emerge in spring. It would breed up beetles, if we just went around our wheel here, and it would then die. The beetle that has emerged in September would die in December or January. Its progeny, the eggs, would develop into larvae. They would start to emerge in December and January and then put on fat and go back into the ground March, April, only to emerge again come spring. So typically a 1-year life cycle for any particular beetle. Another thing that influences how long a life cycle is the climate. And I mentioned before that Buba's bison, our beetle down here in winter, it can have a longer life cycle if the climate is particularly cold. It makes them slow down and it can last for 2 or 3 years. In a normal environment in southern New South Wales, northern Victoria, where they're particularly common, again, you're looking at a 12 to 18-month life cycle. So the question always comes up, does Australia have dung beetles? Yes, we do. We are blessed with around about 500 different species of native dung beetles. I've just taken a screenshot of a Queensland dung beetle project and put that up on the left-hand side there. What have we got? We've got 12 of the 500 species out there, just to let you know that, yeah, we do have a lot of native dung beetles. But, and but is a big but there, most of the Australian native dung beetles are not useful in the processing of the dung from introduced animals. So even though they're there, they're not particularly useful. And that's because the native dung beetles have evolved on the dry pelletized dung of the Australian animals. You've got the wombat cube pictured there, but you can think of your wallaby, your kangaroo dung. It's dry and pelletized, and that's generally what the Australian native dung beetles have worked on. They also generally prefer forested areas. A few species come into paddocks and they do work on sheep and cattle dung, but not many of them. So even though we have a lot, they weren't very good for the introduced species. And so what we did by introducing animals into Australia, such as sheep and cattle, is we created a massive dung problem. So you'll see I've categorized animals down the left-hand side there. We've got the ruminants, the sheep, the cattle, the goats. We've got what we call pseudo-ruminants. They've only got 3 stomachs, not 4. They're your camels and alpacas. And then you've got those with 1 stomach, are the donkeys, your pigs, your horses. Overall, if you add those numbers up, we've got around about 105 million animals that we've introduced into this country. If we just look at those that I've highlighted in yellow, the sheep and the cattle, that's around about 94 million. So these are based on 2021 numbers from Meat and Livestock Australia. So 94 million sheep and cattle combined. If we think about the amount of dung that they're distributing onto the paddocks every year, just go to the highlighted yellow at the bottom of that table, add these 2 numbers up, we're pretty close to 300.
Lost sound.
How is that? Are we back?
Yep, you're back.
Yep.
You're right.
Okay. So we've got about 300 million tonnes of dung just from our cattle and our sheep being distributed onto pastures every year. So that's created a dung problem, but we've got more than just a dung problem. What we've got is fouling of productive land. This picture was commonly seen prior to the introduction of the exotic dung beetles before 1970. This picture's around Gundagai in southern New South Wales in the early to mid 1960s, and it exemplified the problem that you saw. The paddocks were just absolutely littered with dung. It was smothering pasture growth. So we had, or still have in some places where we don't have dung beetles, the issue of productive land being smothered by the dung. Another thing that we see happening is even when we do have dung beetles, is we have loss of productivity because there's no dung beetles there to bury the dung. And what you can see here is a paddock. It's around Wagga Wagga in southern New South Wales. And it's in winter, and you can pick it that it's in winter because the tree in the shot there is denuded of leaves. It's a deciduous tree and it's obviously lost them all. I've circled one of these hummocks that you see throughout the paddock, and we call them rings of repugnance. What you've got here is a loss of productivity because you don't have dung beetles processing the dung in the paddocks. The cattle will not eat the grass that's around the dung. So you can see each of these mounds is simply a buildup of pasture because the cattle or the sheep won't eat the grass that is too close to the dung. So again, because there's no dung beetles, you've lost productivity. Why is this? Well, in this particular case, we do have winter active dung beetles here, but the soil type in this paddock, which is alluvial river flats, is not suitable for the beetle. And even though 1 kilometre or 2 kilometres from this paddock, we've got a high abundance of beetles, and we don't see these loss of productivity on the alluvial river flats because of the soil type we do. And that was another one of the questions. What type of soils do dung beetles prefer? It depends on the dung beetle, but in this particular case, the beetle that should be active in this area in winter isn't active on these pastures. And we see this loss of productive land, or cattle, sheep not eating, because of the foul taste associated with the pasture. This is what you can have if you've got good dung beetle abundance and diversity. You can see you've got cattle grazing here. They've obviously been in there for quite some time. They've grazed the paddock right down. And while you can look at this and see some dung in the pasture, there's very little dung for the number of cattle and the amount of time they've been there. And that's because we've got brilliant dung beetle abundance and diversity, and dung is laying in these paddocks for no more than a few days before it's buried by the dung beetles. So we can reduce pasture fouling and increase productivity and cycle the nutrients by having dung beetle diversity and abundance. Another problem that we face is the dung lying in the pastures creates breeding environments that are suitable for flies and nematodes. This leads to disease issues. For example, if we've got the nematodes or the trematodes, so trematodes are liver flukes. Nematodes, think of barber's pole worm if you're a sheep producer. They can lead to diseases such as bottle jaw in the sheep, where you've got this swelling causes anemia. It can cause death. So you lose productivity, you can lose animals altogether. Pink eye in cattle, a particularly nasty case you can see there where you get the ulceration, loss of productivity. It's caused by a bacterium which is spread by flies landing on dung and transferring the bacterium from the dung to the cattle's eyes. If you can break the nematode cycle, if you can break the fly cycle, then you can reduce these sorts of diseases. So how can you do that? You guessed it, dung beetles are a part of the solution. So they aid in pest and parasite suppression. And how do they do that? They do it by interrupting the fly and the nematode cycles. So I've put the fly life cycle up there. You'll see it's remarkably similar to the dung beetle life cycle. Again, they're just insects. So the insect lays an egg, it turns into a larval stage. We call that a maggot when it's a fly. And the maggot pupates before it becomes a fly again. You can see that I've put up there the eggs are 8 to 24 hours. The maggots take 4 to 7 days before they pupate. This is all taking place in the dung pat. I showed you on the previous slide a pasture which had no dung or very little dung lying on there, and I said it disappeared within a few days. If you can bury the dung and break it up in a few days, then the maggots have no opportunity to develop into pupa, and therefore the next cycle of adult flies is broken. Nematodes are similar. Nematode eggs are passed out in the feces of your sheep and your cattle, your horses, whatever, and they hatch in the dung. It's not until they get to a third stage, larval stage, where they wriggle away from the dung pat and get re-ingested. Again, it takes 4 or 5 days. If you can break up the dung, dry it out with the wind and the solar radiation, then you can break the nematode cycle. So dung beetles with good diversity and abundance can take a dung pat and totally desiccate it, killing nematodes and flies. The image that you can see here is the flies on dung, but the bottom right, there's a ruler here, and this ruler is a measure ruler. You can see that the dung pat has been broken up and distributed into over 1 square meter, and that's happened in 36 hours. So 36 hours it took for this dung pat to be distributed across 1 square meter. You can just look how dry and uninviting for maggots and nematodes that is. It goes on. Soil compaction, reducing plant establishment and causing erosion are major issues associated with having hoofed animals, so the introduced animals. Doesn't matter if we're talking about goats or sheep or cattle or pigs, it's a major problem. We've all seen watering troughs, and as pretty as this picture looks, you can see the soil compaction around the watering trough. There's no plant establishment there. On the right-hand side, you can see after a heavy rain event, the paddocks which have been compressed through extensive grazing are just being washed down the road into the creeks, causing pollution of the creeks, but also losing your valuable soil. So again, dung beetles are part of the solution to this. How so? Well, what I've got here is a soil profile. This started out as a beautiful, clean, no dung beetles were in there, and we had perfectly clean levels of soil in there. The yellow dotted line is the original level of the soil. We then placed dung beetles in there, and over a period of 60 days, roughly 2 months, they transformed this mesocosm, this soil, into what you see in front of you. You can see the soil level is around about 5 or 10 centimetres higher than it was originally. So you've changed the bulk density of the soil. That's great. You can see there's a mass of tunnels. I'll just go across to here. I've put some dots on here, but you can look on the left-hand side and see there's dots and tunneling right throughout. And that involves a beetle, which has taken dung from the surface, tunneled down, created dung masses in which it's laid its egg, and then over time, those dung beetles would hatch. Going across to the right-hand side, we can see from the surface, a tunnel has gone down approximately 30 centimeters, and there's dung masses all throughout where dung beetles are growing as their larval stages. You can see all of this over here is where you've got your tunneling, extensive tunneling, translocation of nutrients from the dung down into the soil, and obviously increased aeration and water infiltration. So now when the water hits the soil, instead of being a compacted surface, it soaks in a lot easier. And related to that is the pollution issue that's associated with compacted pastures. And I'm not here talking about dirt washing into waterways. I'm talking about dung washing into waterways. So on the left-hand side, we can see paddock where water is freely running off it. And if you see what happens once that hits your waterways, whether that be a dam, a creek, or a river, you can see an abundance of nutrients causes what we call eutrophication, algal blooms. It's great growth in the river, but that's not where you want it. You'd much prefer those nutrients to stay in your pasture. And again, you can achieve this by dung beetles. I keep going back to their part of the solution, because dung beetles, through their tunneling activity, and that's why I say we're particularly interested in the tunnelers, through their tunneling activity, they're bringing up soil. This is obviously a red soil here. They're bringing up the soil to the surface, and in the process taking dung down. So you've got this nutrient cycling, and the dung is no longer available on the surface. It's being taken down into the ground. If we take a shovel and scoop off the dung, the picture on the right-hand side is what it looks like when you've got good dung beetle activity. And if you've got keen eyes, you might even see there's a dung beetle that's plugging one of these holes. But each one of these holes, it looks like a sponge or a crumpet. Each one of these holes goes down around about 30 centimeters and obviously provides a brilliant access for water and air to get down in there to aerate and moisten your soil. So let's move on to another topic, and that is, do I have dung beetles? Well, how do you know if you've got dung beetles? We encourage everybody to monitor dung beetles, and as I said before, we can make available those colourful seasonal wheels. So as you collect a dung beetle, you can pin it to your seasonal wheel. Next time you talk to us, you can tell us what beetle you have in what season. What you need to do monitoring is you need a bucket, a shovel, access to some water, a camera, which simply means your phone these days. And if you want to collect your dung beetles, some containers. You might want to collect the dung beetles because maybe you want to send them to us and get us to identify them for you. We'll do that for you free of charge. So you simply go to the paddock with your shovel, your trowel, and you put your dung into a bucket. You then pour some water into the bucket. Do not stir it. There is no need to stir it. If you stir it, you just create a horrible soup, and it makes it hard for you to find the dung beetles amongst all the grass and everything else that floats to the surface. So don't stir it, just pour it in. What we generally recommend people to do is they take 3 or 4 buckets out, they walk along, fill the buckets up. By the time you get back to the first bucket, a few minutes, then you can see the beetles have floated to the surface. Collect them and then have a go at starting to identify them. So how do you identify dung beetles? Well, the best way to identify dung beetles is for me to send you to the Dung Beetle Ecosystem Engineers website. That's listed up here at the top. It's www.dungbeetles.com.au. Just make sure you use the plural. If you don't use the plural, you'll go to a site that exists up in Queensland. If you use the plural, you'll see a website full of a pile of information, and on there are some ID sheets, and they will guide you through diagnostic features that you should be looking for in the beetles that you've collected in your bucket and have now got back with you in your shed or in your house. When you photograph a beetle, we want you to take at least 4 photographs. We would like to see one from the side, one from the front, one from the top, and one from underneath. For example, this beetle over here is called Ornithophagus nigroventris, and the name actually tells us a lot about the beetle. Ornithophagus going back to our ladder, is the genus. And onto means dung, fagus means to eat. So we know this means dung eating. Nigriventris means dark stomach. So if you were to turn this beetle over and show me a picture from underneath, I'm going to see that it's almost jet black underneath. So again, a simple photograph can tell us a lot about a beetle. We've got others which have got yellow patches on their shoulders. Others, it's the horns which tell us something. And we see this best by seeing 4 photographs, side, front, top, and underneath. Your smartphones take brilliant photographs. And if you do that with your beetles, you can either then go to this website and try identifying them yourself, or you're more than welcome to send us the photographs and we'll attempt to identify them for you. You can also send us the entire beetle, but if you do that, just dry it out on your windowsill for a few days to start with so that it doesn't smell. So you dry the beetle out. We'll have the beetle, so we can look at it carefully, but we will want to know from you where it's from and the date that you collected it. Knowing the location it's from and the time of the year tells us a lot about what the beetle could possibly be. So now know how to monitor for dung beetles and see what you've got, and we're more than willing to help you out there with the identification. This is a map that we've constructed at Ecoinsects, which shows us every reported identification of dung beetles throughout Australia. You might look at this map and think, wow, there's a lot of spots on there. I look at this map and think, wow, there's a lot of vacant spots on there. So in other words, despite the fact that this has around about 100,000 observations entailed with all of those spots, there's an awful lot of this country where we don't know much about dung beetles. And there's an awful lot of this country which unfortunately still doesn't have dung beetles. And part of what we want to do at Ecoinsects is to fill in as many of those gaps as we possibly can. This map's an in-house resource that we have, but if you call us up, tell us where you are, this map's interactive. We can zoom in on your actual property. And while it's unlikely we're going to have dung beetle identifications for your property, we can get nearby and know what's been identified near your property. We can put climate overlays on this map so we can see the rainfall zone you're in. We can see temperatures in winter and summer where you are. We can see the vegetation overlays and see what sort of vegetation you have. We don't have this capacity yet, but we hope that the Atlas of Living Australia that we built this map from will soon have soil overlays in there, so we'll be able to know what sort of soil types on your property as well. What we're telling you here is that we can get a lot of information to help you and help us help you by this in-house resource that we've created. So going to the question, where have the beetles gone? Where have the beetles gone assumes that at one stage you had beetles on your property, but you are no longer seeing them. Well, that could simply be because they're seasonal. So what we've got here is a beetle called Onitis caffa, and you're very unlikely to see it in December, January or February. It's a winter active beetle. So it simply might be that you saw it in winter and it's disappeared because it's a winter active beetle. Or conversely, maybe it was a summer active beetle. You might have Onitis alexis. It's a summer active beetle. You might have seen it in November, December, but then it disappears on your property in winter. So this could be what's happened to your beetles. They're simply seasonal. And that's an important thing for us to know, because if you want to have ecosystem services on your property to provide you all those benefits that we talked about, then you need beetles throughout the entire year. So what we've got up here is a graph of January through December. And then if you look down the left-hand side there, this is just dung quantity. So the kilograms of dung produced per hectare. And there's no numbers there because it changes so much with stocking rates, with rainfalls, with pasture quality, the way that you graze your animals. But this is a cartoon that lets us depict to you what goes on in so many properties throughout Australia. And you can see that in summer, let's just focus on January over here. In summer, where I'm hovering with the mouse, it's the dung processed by the beetles. So the bottom dotted line is the dung processed by dung beetles. And you can see that in summer months, it's pretty close to the amount of dung that's produced by the livestock. As we progress through autumn into winter, into spring, that diverges. And this is the common picture throughout Australia. We have very few winter active and spring active beetles in the country. We're trying to address that. We're breeding spring active beetles up at Ecoinsects, but they're still several years away from being available. But you can see that in this particular example, October is identified as the biggest service gap. There's an enormous amount of dung that's being produced that isn't being utilised by the dung beetles simply because the summer actives haven't emerged yet and we don't have any spring active beetles available. So we try to keep this gap as small as possible by making sure that you've got the correct selection of dung beetles. And really, you're going to need at least half a dozen different species on your property to be servicing these regions, these seasons throughout the year. So there's three other possibilities as to where have the beetles gone. And I've highlighted those on the left-hand side, and they are flood, drought, and chemicals. And we'll treat each of them in turn. So we've just been through 3 years of La Nina, and last year we had particularly devastating floods throughout wide parts of Australia. We're based around Canberra and Wagga Wagga, so we saw the central west flooded right down through southern Riverina into Victoria and across to South Australia, and there was vast amounts of the country underwater, and that's killed millions, billions of dung beetles. So if we click on this, the cartoon that you saw has now been inundated, and those tunnels, obviously, if there's water above them, go down and drown the insects. They're insects, they breathe air, they can't survive underwater, and so many, many beetles simply drowned as a result of the floods. If you're in one of the regions that were extensively flooded, then you may have lost many, if not all, of your dung beetles. And we saw this around parts of Forbes, where we've monitored before and after the floods, and 90 to 95% of the beetles we estimate have been wiped out. So water is an obvious killer. Drought is less obvious for a killer of dung beetles, but if you think about dung being laid down in the good times, and dung beetles in the season took the dung under the ground, and they've created all these brood masses down under the ground, and so that's your next generation of beetles existing as the larval stage down there. Then a drought comes along, and so you destock. The animals are no longer there to deposit dung. So when your dung beetles come into summer, if they're a summer active beetle, they emerge in summer, and they come up and they look around for something to eat, and it's not there. They are capable of flying. Remember, they're coleoptera, which means shielded wings. So they've all got the capacity to fly, but they can't fly long distances. They can't fly over mountains. They certainly won't fly through forests. So if there's cattle within a kilometre or a couple of kilometres, then the dung beetles, they'll leave your property, but they will be able to survive and go to the next property where perhaps the stock still exists. If we had widespread destocking, which we did see throughout the drought of 2019, 2018, then we saw regions in northwest and northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, which due to destocking, once again, lost all of their dung beetles. They're slowly coming back, but again, it takes concerted restocking efforts to redistribute dung beetles in those areas so that they build up their numbers quickly. And again, you get the ecosystem services that they provide. The third one is chemicals, and we aren't anti-chemicals at Ecoinsects. Chemicals are absolutely necessary for animal health, but it's the misuse of animal health and pesticides which can have severe impacts on non-target organisms, which can lead to a loss of your dung beetles. So I think it was Scott mentioned earlier in the comments that he's starting to see beetles come back to his property after he's been on it for 4 years, and the previous owner apparently used a lot of chemicals. So again, chemicals may be absolutely necessary to use, but it's the misuse which can be a problem. If you know what dung beetles you've got, if you know their life cycles, you can moderate your chemical use so that you're using your anthelminthics, your worming agents, for example, to the best possible strategy to provide the animal health outcomes that are required, but also protect the dung beetles, because the dung beetles are adding valuable economic input to your property. You may not be aware of it, but they're doing so many good things for you that you really do want to maintain them. So by understanding the life cycle of the beetles, what we try to emphasize here is use your chemicals, but use them wisely. And we can do entire seminars on this. We certainly don't have time for it here. Again, what we will do is direct you to the website, dungbeetles.com.au. And what we've got up there is a guide to managing dung beetles on your farm. And it's around about a 10 or 11 page booklet that you can just download. And there's several tables in there. I don't want to go through the table, but table 2 is a list of veterinary chemicals in common use and their potential impact upon dung beetles. And what we will single out here are the red ones, the red highlighted ones. There's a high impact on dung beetles. They're a group called synthetic pyrethroids. And then we've got what we call the mectins, commonly used to treat both internal and external parasites. So your worms, some of your ticks, etc. They're also, in the main, very toxic towards dung beetles. There's one of them, which is moxidectin, which I showed on the previous slide, sold as Sidectin as a brand name. It's the most dung beetle friendly of the mectin-based drenches. And again, you can use it when you've got high populations of dung beetles. For example, most of you will have them in summer. If you haven't, then you can use any of the drenches. But if you've got dung beetles that are particularly active, think about which drench you're going to use and use it wisely. So the next thing is, how do you construct a nursery? This is to grow dung beetles on your property. The easiest way, or an easy way, is to simply grab an IBC. Many people have IBCs lying around on their property not being used. Grab yourself an angle grinder, cut it in half, and you've got the capacity, once you've cut it in half, to have 2 dung beetle nurseries. What you want to do is drill a lot of holes in the bottom of this. You want to drill holes so that it doesn't fill up with water. Once you've drilled some holes in there, get yourself some geotextile. We simply use shade cloth, and put the shade cloth down here. And you're going to do that so that the dung beetles, when they dig down, hit the shade cloth and don't dig through and go out the holes into the ground. So you put some shade cloth down or other appropriate geotextile, and then fill it up with soil from your property. You can see in this other half of the IBC, you can see the soil that's in there. This is now a dung beetle nursery once you've rigged up a lid, and this is simply some more shade cloth, which is across the top. You put the dung beetles that you want in there, most probably ones that aren't already on your property. There's no point breeding up ones that are on your property, but if you want to get another species in, you might want to do a combination of a field release and also breed some up so that you've got another, release that you can do in the subsequent years. Simply feed them dung, nice, clean, chemical-free dung, keep them moist, and you'll have beetle progeny produced year after year. The commitment is high. It will take you 6 to 12 months of weeding or watering and feeding, but the payback is the dung beetles you get. There's many ways to construct nurseries, and this information will be available on our website. So I've talked about dung beetles, but Ecoinsects isn't just about dung beetles. We also sell predatory species, and these are a great complement to the dung beetles. So the predatory species, you can see histonomas in this image. Look at the jaws on it. These jaws are made for ripping through larvae, whether that be a maggot, an insect larvae, or a worm larvae. They go through, they literally bite them in half, then suck the innards out. The end result is the beetle satisfied and the worm or the maggot is dead. So these are, in Australia, they have been since 1967 as an introduced species, but they're not widely distributed throughout the country, and they've got the capacity to be. We've seen them from central Queensland right through to Tasmania. So we know that they're widely climatically suitable, and they just haven't been distributed widely. So keep these in mind as a potential complement to your dung beetles. There's a bit of a video there. I don't know if it's going to play. We'll just skip on. Now, one other thing is what we call predatory mites. So what you can see in these images on the left and the right-hand side, a dung beetle, that's the big black beetle, and on him or her is or are a lot of small mites, the little orangey flesh-coloured mites. These are what we call phoretic mites, and they're simply using the dung beetle as a transport mechanism between dung pats. So the dung beetle will fly between dung pats, carrying these mites from dung pat to dung pat as it goes. These mites are predatory, just as Histonomas was, and they chew their way through the eggs of nematodes. So if you think about the threadworm eggs, which I've picked in that middle picture there, these little predatory mites are getting in there and chewing through your worms, chewing through your worm eggs. So they're great to have in your dung as well. We don't specifically sell predatory mites, but we often don't remove them from the dung beetles because we know they're beneficial. So if you ever get a shipment of dung beetles and you see these small mites on them, don't be concerned. We've deliberately left them there because they're beneficial in the ecosystem in eating their way through nematode eggs. So that basically ends the presentation, and we'll go to questions, but I want to just end on how can we help you. And there's three ways what we think. We can provide the virtual knowledge and advice around dung beetles, and we've hopefully started that tonight, but we can also do more in-depth webinars or on-farm workshops with farming systems groups and land care groups. So we're happy to do both of those. And the third is obvious. We can provide beetles, whether they be predatory beetles or dung beetles, that are suited to your needs. And it's really important that you get the beetles that are best for your climate, are best for your soil type, and are best for your farming operation. Some beetles are better with sheep and some beetles are better with cattle. If you've got both, then we'll make sure you have both stocked on your property. I think what we'll do is leave it there, and I can see the chat has been busy, and we'll get Paul to, who's probably been collating questions, to MC the questions.
Certainly. So the first one, we've just had a repeat of the same question. So bioworma or Dunantonia, which is the fungal species that is the active in it, is it dung beetle friendly?
Yes. The bioworma is not harmful to your dung beetles. The way that bioworma works is it's a fungus, and the fungus actually captures the nematodes, and you see these under microscope. It's both amazing and frightening, and strangles the nematodes and then digests them. So imagine a fungus forming a lasso. The worm goes through it and triggers the lasso to close, and it is then digested by the fungus. No problems on the dung beetles whatsoever.
The next one is, Russ, nursery versus releases. Which should you do and why?
Yeah. Nurseries are generally for the rarer species. So a field release, we would typically say 1,000 beetles. 1,000 beetles gives the beetles the best opportunity to find a mate when they're released into a paddock, because they're going to distribute. So it gives them the best opportunity to find a mate, breed, and so that they can produce successive generations. So that's all well and good if you're able to get 1,000 beetles to start a colony on your property. Some beetles are particularly hard to collect, and some beetles are just rare. So you might only have the opportunity to get 50 or 100 of them. And in that particular case, if you put them into a nursery such as the IBCs that we showed, then that 100 beetles could turn into 1,000 beetles in the following year. So that's only a 10-to-1 reproduction rate. So both have their purpose, and we certainly have clients who will who'll buy 1,000 beetles from us, and they'll release 900 into a paddock and keep 100 aside and put them in their nursery with the intention that next year they can release another 1,000 from that, and they can then hold back 100 and then do it again and again and again. So it's just a matter of whether or not you want to commit the time, as I said, 6 to 12 months time investment to breed up that next generation in a nursery, or if you're happy to buy the beetles as you require them.
So in terms of keeping a nursery, we've often talked about it as not dissimilar to having chickens. They need water and they need food on an almost daily basis. Just like chickens would, you need to be out there checking them. If you get a really big shower of rain, you don't want them to drown in that IBC. Up here in Queensland, where I am, we've had 400 mils in an afternoon, so you don't want that. So you put a bit of cover over there, but you need to keep the soil a little bit moist. If it gets too dry and too hard, they have a problem. They dry out. So there is a bit of work to be able to keep them going, but it has been worthwhile for many people. Another question we've got here is what sort of ratios? How do you know how many to introduce? Is it per head of stock? Do you go per land area? What's the best approach if I want to get a new species on my farm?
Yes, well, funny you should ask that question. It's a question we often get. So the question there is, what's the optimal density? And it really depends on the beetle. What we've got here is me comparing two beetles. One of them is Buba's bison, which is a winter active beetle, and the one on the right is called Ornithophagus taurus. It's a summer active. And I'm just going to compare them to show you that optimal densities change. Buba's bison is a big beetle. Each beetle weighs just shy of 0.5 gram at, say, 400 milligrams, whereas Ornithophagus taurus is a small beetle. Each one of them only weighs 50 to 60 milligrams. So you'll need 20 of them per gram, whereas you need 2 of the Buba's bison per gram. The photo in the middle there is the dung that's being processed by Buba's bison, and you can see the enormous amount of soil that's being brought to the surface. We estimate that if you've got over 2,000 of them per hectare, then that's a pretty good density. And obviously it depends on your stocking rates. But in southern New South Wales, where these can be prolific, 2,000 beetles per hectare is a good number. And we've certainly seen much, much higher than that, but that's a good number. That would process the dung very effectively. The Ornithophagus taurus, on the other hand, you really want, over 6,000 of those per hectare. And again, you can get many tens of thousands of these per hectare in optimal seasons with good dung quality. So there's no simple answer to the question, but you'll know if you've got good dung beetle densities, because the dung on your property will be being processed exceptionally well. I'll put it into another story. We've got an operation down near Albury where they do strip grazing. So every 2 days, the cattle are moved on to another strip. So we can go to that property knowing full well that the strip adjacent to where the cattle are, the dung is only 2 days old. Sometimes we find it hard to find dung because it has all been buried. And there we estimate, we're talking about Buba's bison in this particular example, we estimate there's up to 7,000 beetles per hectare operating on that dung.
So Ross, if I've got a few thousand hectares, for example, how many should I be putting out of something like bison, and how fast are they going to grow to fill what I need?
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously, if you, let's say I've said 2,000 per hectare for Buba's bison. If you've got 100 hectares, then you need 2,000 times 100. What's that? 200,000 beetles. So that's a lot of beetles to put out. So most people would seed their properties and then wait for natural organic growth to populate that land. And that's how it's been done throughout Australia since the 1960s. The late 1960s is when the first dung beetle was actually introduced by CSIRO into the field. And, there's certainly regions out there now where there's millions and millions of these dung beetles. So organic growth does work. It just takes time. What sort of reproduction rate can you expect in the wild? Well, that really really does depend on dung quantity, dung quality, the season. Is it particularly hot? Is it particularly wet? All of these factors have to be taken into consideration. But if we've got a 5 to 10-fold population increase every year, then we consider that pretty good under natural circumstances. So if you were to put 1,000 beetles out, let's go with the 10-fold increase, then the following year you'd have 10,000. The next year you'd have 100,000, so on and so on. So it doesn't take too many years to build it up, but it is, it's not an overnight fix. You do have to wait for the dung beetle populations to establish.
Can you have multiple species in the same nursery?
We don't. There's no reason you couldn't, because that's the way they survive out in the wild. There's multiple species. For example, in the dung pat that you see in front of you, there'd be at least 2 species in there from knowing where that property is. So while you can have multiple species in the one nursery, I would not, because you're trying to grow a particular dung beetle, and so you want to make sure that the effort you're applying to it is being applied to that beetle. Occasionally you'll get beetles coming in as volunteers in the dung that you're feeding, so they'll be there, but try to minimize it and focus your attention on the beetles that you're trying to breed.
A question here around broadacre composting. Does that help or hinder? And on the back of that one was chemical fertilizer application to pasture. Does that help or hinder?
So, look, so chemical fertilizer application doesn't seem to be a major issue, but there's a caveat to that. It depends how. If it's just on the back of a truck and distributed, then it's not a major problem. We do discourage the use of harrowing, because some of these dung beetles have got their progeny in dung balls, 5 centimeters beneath the surface. So if you go along and rip the surface, then you'll be killing those species of dung beetles that are simply just below the surface. Broadacre composting, haven't actually got any specific examples to give on that. The cattle or the sheep, which could be in there before that, would have deposited the dung, I imagine you could get some decomposition and thatching, but no specific advice on that unless you've got any, Paul.
Look, the only one I understand is horse context with some of the horse clubs, for example, around Brisbane here that have dung beetles. They will leave, they'll move the horses from one paddock to the next. They'll leave the dung for a couple of days before they put their little machine in that breaks the dung up, because they assume that they're going to have had some of them go in, do some processing, put some brood balls down. So they're giving those dung beetles a bit of a chance first, and they probably go for a bit of a wander to see if they've got much activity first as well. So, yeah, look, I don't think it'd be a problem, particularly if you've got some unprocessed dung and the dung has been there for a little while, then dry dung is not going to be processed. Dry dung is of no interest to any dung beetle. So definitely breaking that up and moving it around is a good thing. The next one here is, can they tunnel in heavy clay soils?
Yeah, if you've got a beetle that likes heavy clay soils, they certainly can. And I've got the picture on the screen of Buba's bison, and it likes the heavier soils. I gave the example where we showed those rings of repugnance, and that was on alluvial soil, sandy soil. Buba's bison will avoid it. It just simply won't establish on sandy soils. So they're actually wonderful for some of those heavier clay soils, because they are taking dung down into it, breaking it up, bringing clay to the surface, and basically tilling your soil for you. So the right species, yes, it can work very well.
The example I'd like to give is Anitis Kaffir. Up here in Queensland, we saw an example of where the cattle were moved from one pasture to the next along a very hard compacted gravel road, and the Kaffir managed to go through the gravel and was actually digging up the road base underneath it and bringing that to the surface. They had no problem going through road base and gravel, let alone hard clay.
Yeah, they're amazing in their capacity to dig.
Yep. Are beetles impacted by frosts and snow?
Look, some. Again, I keep going back to Buba's bison here because it's a winter active species. In some of our trapping, we've pulled them out of trays at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the water in the tray that we used to trap them was frozen. And we assumed that the beetle would be dead, but we pulled it out and put it on the back of the tailgate of the truck while we did other things. And by the time we had come back, the beetle was moving around. So there's absolute evidence to say, yes, they can survive frosts and certainly a light freezing, if we can have a light freezing. Snow, well, the spring active beetle that I mentioned, Onthophagus vacca, the species that we're dealing with there is from Morocco. Now, you might think, where's he going with this? Why is he mentioning snow in Morocco? Morocco's in northern Africa, but there's a group of mountains up there called the Atlas Mountains, and they're full of snow. And the Onthophagus vacca dung beetle spends 3 months of the year covered in snow. So whilst it's not active during that period, it's certainly subject to those cold, snowy climates. And so, yes, it can survive, certainly in the ground, insulated by the soil with snow on top of it. And Buba's bison, as I say, we've pulled them out of frozen water. And so, yeah, they can survive light frosts and in the ground under snow blankets. North America is another example.
Yeah, certainly. And well, northern Europe has plenty of beetles.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if I've bought some beetles and I've released them out, how do I stop them from leaving my farm?
You don't. Look, we always get this question, and there's dung beetles aren't going to go past the next dung pat. So when you do release beetles, and when we supply beetles, we give a release guide, and you have to understand the way that a beetle finds dung is either smells the sheep or the cattle or the dung. So any of those smells. So you've got to think about, if you're the dung beetle, where are you going to fly? You're going to fly upwind, because you're going to fly into the wind because the wind is blowing those smells towards you. You can only smell the smells coming downwind from it. So how can you maintain the release on your property? I'd release them, at least in the middle of your property, if not towards the bottom end of the property, so that they fly upwind into it. But over time, the beetles that you release on your property will go to your neighbours, but rest assured, your neighbours' beetles will also come to yours.
I think the other thing that I'm always surprised at is well, I won't say how lazy they are in terms of flying, but flying for some of these big beetles must use a lot of energy. So they'll get up and walk to the next dung pad if it's close enough.
Absolutely,
and
we see
that all the time. But we've also seen, and again, I'll use the example of Calf or Gazella up here in Queensland. Rob, who works with us, when he moves his cattle from one place to the next, it might only be a few hundred meters. He'll be on the motorbike and he'll push the cattle. He said immediately, especially because he's moves them in the evening, he'll see the beetles getting up and chasing after the cows because they want the fresh dung. And he'll be hitting them, or they'll be hitting him on his motorbike on the way back to the house as they head after those cows. So if you think about where some of these species came from, if they came from Southern Africa, which many of them did, they would have had to get up and move and chase the cows every single day as those species migrated across the plains. So they're used to moving along with the animals and feeding and moving and feeding and moving. They don't tend to want to go much further than that until the population gets very large and there's more beetles than there is food, in which case they'll start to spread. So we do get asked, why is it my neighbor 2 k's down the road has this species and I don't? Well, they're happy there and they've got plenty of dung at this point. If they run out of dung, they probably will make their way to your place. But it doesn't mean that you can't have a chat to him and maybe get some beetles from him if you're prepared to go out and do the trapping. But be aware that you can have dangers in trapping other beetles, and I'll leave Russ to describe some of those ones.
The dangers in trapping other beetles?
In trapping beetles down the road and bringing them back to your farm.
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, there's the, let's get back out of that. So the problem with indiscriminately collecting beetles is not all beetles are good. And I always use the example of the African black beetle. And if I was to collect beetles, not sort them, and send them across a state line, sending a pest into another state, or even within a state, is not desirable, but certainly sending them into another state would get the biosecurity officers very upset with me. So we supply beetles across Australia, and indeed we supply them internationally. But we will either carefully clean the beetles or make sure that there's no pest species amongst them. So you certainly don't want to go to a property, put out a trap, just take the entire contents of that trap and put them on your property. Because, yeah, you might be getting the good ones, but you may also be bringing back pests which are going to destroy your pastures. So be very careful about pest species amongst the beneficial insects.
The other pests to point to is the other things that are in the dung, of course.
Of course, yeah. I mean,
and
most of them are.
We're very aware of how much we have to clean our beetles, particularly when we send them to Western Australia. They get stopped at the border and they do check them. And yeah, if there's any sign of any dung in the material that we send, they get turned around or they get destroyed. Because they will not allow, and we don't allow any dung to get moved around because that's a risk to you and your farm. Have we got any other questions that anyone would like to ask?
We can do it verbally. We can go off mute if you want to ask the question.
If you release them successfully, how long till you see an improvement?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on how many you released and how rapidly they multiply. But we would say that you release them in year one, and then we often have people the following year saying, I can't find any of them. And so it's often not the following year, but 2 or 3 years down the track where you start to see obvious impacts produced by the beetles that you released 2 or 3 years ago. I use the example given to me by one of the pioneers in dung beetles in this country, a gentleman called John Feehan, who was involved with the CSIRO dung beetle project back in the 1960s and is still active in the space now. And he tells me, or told me, that it took 4 years after the first releases from CSIRO beetles before they found them in any areas where they'd released them. And for a while there, they thought they were being incredibly non-successful in establishing. But if you think about releasing 1,000 beetles into 1 hectare and then go back and find them, and they're going to spread further than a hectare, then it's a big job. So, 1,000 becomes 10,000, becomes 100,000. Then you're starting to find those beetles that you released. So it's just relying on organic growth. One way to get the results quicker is to release more beetles.
One of the things that we do though is we get out and put traps out, which are often a little bit more reliable than just looking for the beetle activity itself. When you go out to catch beetles, and we showed you the bucket trick, one of the things that we learned early on is that you actually have to walk softly up to the dung pad. Now, I know this sounds a little strange, but if you just clomp up to it, or if you pull up in the ute right next to the dung pad, the vibrations are enough to actually cause a problem. They disappear down the hole. And in the case of something like bison or kaffir that are very, very deep, they're down almost a meter. So there's no way on earth that you're going to see them or catch them. So you have to almost creep up on the dung pad and flip a bit of it. And we usually take a couple of centimeters of soil from underneath the dung pad as well with a shovel and stick it straight into the bucket of water. But if you're also, the other option is we can show you some information if anyone's interested in different types of traps. Now, Russ, in releasing vaca into one of our areas in the very early years, we put out a couple of thousand, I think it was, Russ, or even less than that. And we were pretty worried that we weren't going to see it again. And we're thinking in 4 years' time, maybe we'll see it. The following year, Russ came back and was very excited to say, I've actually found it. It is out there. It has bred. It's gone through a cycle. So there's more out there. A couple more questions. If herds of cattle come and go from a property, how long will the beetles remain without cattle present?
Yeah, again, that depends on the life cycle. So remember that the beetle may only be, the adult may only be above the ground for, say, 3 to 4 months. The rest of that time, it's down under the ground, chewing through the dung that the egg was laid in. So it hatches, turns into the larvae. So this is why we say it's important to know what beetles you've got and to know about their life cycle. So, you know, with a rotational grazing operation, if we're talking about going from a paddock to a paddock, that's generally not a problem, because as long as the beetles are within, you know, let's just say 1 kilometre, then they'll be able to smell the sheep or the cattle and fly to them. It's more a case if you're moving them great distances and there's no cattle or sheep in between, then you run the risk of starvation.
The next one I'll take. So it's, can you give a rough price on a package of beetles? And it says a particular example that you've seen in the past. I understand it's complex. We try actually not to make it too complex for exactly this reason. So in the past, we have, and we still do, supply specific species on request. So if you actually know exactly what you want, not a problem. We will try to find those species for you, and we will try and deliver exactly that species. But in many cases, we know that people are going out and they're saying, look, there's very few, you know, less than 1 or 2 per dung pad. I know I need a range of species. Can you provide dung beetles, in inverted commas, for my farm? So we've actually decided the easiest way to do this now is we provide either a summer pack or a winter pack. So a summer pack, depending on where you are, will have the species that you need. As long as you can tell us where you are, your soil types, your rainfall, are you on the side of the hill? Are you down in the valley? We'll match that with the right species. So a $1,500 summer pack will give you anywhere up to about 5,000 beetles of, depending on where you are, it could be 4 or 5 different species in there. A winter pack is a little different because, again, it depends on where you are. The winter pack might arrive in 2 parts, one that's more autumn sort of related and one that's very much winter related, because you've got species that are quite different. Again, it depends where you are. But yeah, we've decided that the easiest way is just to provide them as packs and to do those mixed species. But if you know what you need and you know that you're missing one that you want, by all means, ask for them specifically. The next question, are dung beetles only interested in fresh dung? Is there a time frame, i.e. number of days, before they won't be interested?
Yes, they're only interested in fresh dung. Remember, the beetle, the adult, isn't chewing its way through dung, it's filter feeding. So it's sucking the juices and it's filtering out of there bacteria, fungi, and maybe minute particles of dung, but they're not capable of chewing. They're you know, I always use the caterpillar and the butterfly example here. I mean, the caterpillar munches its way through a leaf, but the butterfly, it's got entirely different mouth parts. The same is true of a dung beetle. The adult dung beetle has entirely different mouth parts to the larva. The larva eats the dung in the dung mass under the ground, but the adult is sucking the juices. So therefore, they're only interested in juicy dung. As the dung dries out, it desiccates, they're no longer interested in it.
And this is a key thing for those of you who are in more extensive areas where you might be in drier environments as well. And you will notice that the dung that comes out is generally drier and actually, you know, mounds up, as opposed to some of you who might be in somewhere in Victoria or Tasmania where the dung that comes out is a splatter of liquid. There's a big difference between those in terms of what the dung beetle is going to go for. It will still go for those mounds. The species that live in those areas have adapted to go for that, and we know that they still work. You'll see them You'll often see some of those hard lumps of dung, and you think that's just a giant lump of dung, and you pick it up and it's like a meringue. It's actually hollow inside. It's been hollowed out. So the job has been done. They've actually aerated it. They've taken away all the moisture. So they've done a lot of that job, and they've taken a fair bit of it away and buried it. The perfect dung pad for many of them is probably about 4 to 5 centimeters high and nice and wet. And it's only an hour or two old at the most. And we even see them, you describe them as a trench or a sump, Russ?
Yeah, a sump. So they'll dig little pits underneath the dung, maybe a few centimeters into the ground. And what it causes is the juices from the dung to gather in that sump, and then the beetles sit down there and filter feed on the juices. And the net impact of that is that the dung dries out. It then uses that drier dung and takes it down into the ground to line the tunnels and produce brood masses. Or if they're a roller, they'll create balls and roll it away.
So little piggies at a trough. Very nice. I'll just go back also to the pricing question before. One of the other ones I've had is about for small farms. So the summer pack and the winter pack we tend to supply to larger producers, commercial producers. We also provide a small farm pack, which is designed for the lifestyle blocks, people with a handful of cows, 2 sheep, 3 goats, and a horse. As long as you're not drenching those horses every 3rd week, you should be okay. But we can certainly provide information on that. A small farm pack comes at the same time. It's just designed to have 2 to 3 species that will suit your area, and anywhere up to about 1,000. And that retails for about $480, I think it is, $480 plus the delivery. So that makes it a bit more affordable. It is still enough to get them established, but they will take a little bit longer. We do have people sometimes buying, if you're very keen on your beetles, they'll buy nursery numbers. So that might be down around the few hundred beetles with the intention of setting up a nursery, and we can supply that as well. So if you're struggling to be able to afford that for your lifestyle block, not a problem. We can provide a couple of, if you're willing to put the work in, they'll do their own procreation. The other option that we do recommend is, as farmers, talk to your local land care groups. We do a lot with land care groups, and often they are able to access funding for groups to actually buy beetles with them. And we often do a deal with those land care groups to do a training day or another webinar like this, plus some monitoring in the area. And they're able to access some grant money of one type or another that can subsidize people getting beetles as well. Okay. Do you need different species for different animals? So dung from sheep, cattle, and horses?
Look, no, but there is a preference. And there's a particular beetle which is very abundant in northern Tasmania. It's commonly called the blue bomber because it's a beautiful blue iridescence to it, and it loves horse dung. So if you were to offer that particular beetle, horse dung versus cattle or sheep dung, you'd probably find 20 times more in the horse dung. So there is a preference. But if you had the beetle and no horses, then it would quite happily munch its way through the cattle or sheep dung. So there's certainly preferences, and if you've got a paddock full of sheep next to a paddock full of cattle, you might find different species in the different paddocks, but they are generally accepting most dung types, including dog dung, I might add. So people do find that when they're on properties and they've got a lot of dung beetles, they don't have problems with the dog dung building up because the beetles actually single that out quite rapidly.
And we're getting right to the end now, but we might just touch on this one. So we've got a question around which drenches are safe. Now, to be honest, we do run a sort of an advanced dung beetle webinar, and we'll probably run a couple of those over the next month as well, where we go through this in a lot of detail because it is complex. There are so many different types of drenches and the way that they work that we have to go through that carefully. And depending on where you are and what pest or parasite you're actually targeting can make a difference there as well, and the time of the year and what beetles you have. So we do tend to run some more advanced ones on that. But Russ, if you want to do a very general, rough answer to that one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you've summed it up. I mean, are there any chemicals that are safe for dung beetles? Yeah, absolutely there are. And we'll advice on that. And any advice, we'll state this right up front, any advice we give is to replace specific veterinary advice. We're not a vet. I'm not a vet. Paul's not a vet. So, we're not going to give you advice that you should take over specific veterinary advice, but we can advise you on those animal health and pesticide chemicals which are much more friendly to dung beetles. So I had up on one of the slides moxidectin, for example. Moxidectin is a drench which is used to treat a wide variety of both endo and ectoparasites. Just think of your intestinal worms. It's very safe for your dung beetles, and we recommend to people in summer when they've got high abundance of dung beetles, but maybe also want to do a drench, find yourself some moxidectin. We've got a client down in the Monero, down in southern New South Wales, who's surrounded by forest. He couldn't get moxidectin one year, and he used another drench on his sheep, and he killed the worms and he killed all of the dung beetles on his property. And it took several years for him to get them back. So be careful with what you use. We can give advice, but also talk to your vet.
Okay, we do have a couple of quick ones. We'll try and squeeze them in. Do you have a species recommendation for a summer active beetle in WA on clay soils an hour east of Perth? Quite specific there, but I would say yes.
At a guess, one of the Uniticella species, I'd probably go with fulvus or intermedius. There's several species that would be applicable in that region.
And we've got one last question. I'll come back to people asking for specific stuff for their own farm, but just to finish here, are there dung beetle species for chicken and poultry manure?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question, and we find a lot of people now are incorporating chickens into their rotational grazing, where several days after the cattle have moved on, they put the chickens over. It's usually not a problem because the dung beetles have done their thing and moved on. We find that there's beetles which will happily munch their way through the chicken dung. The ones that survive the best are the nocturnal species, because otherwise the chickens eat the diurnal species. So if you've got dung beetles around the chickens, I've seen it, the chickens will eat the beetles. So once the chickens are bedded down for the night and you've got dung beetles which only operate at night and you've got others which only operate during the day, then you can certainly have species which will be operating quite happily on the chicken dung. Yep.
And we won't discuss bin chickens, which we have up here in abundance. And
they're a problem for the dung beetles. They eat the dung beetles.
They do indeed. Okay, just coming back to if you do have specific questions around your own farm, you've got our email address there. So it's inquiries@Ecoinsects. Send us an email. What we need to know is where you are. Now, we don't need an exact address. Happy to take one, but a rough estimate of where you are, so we have a bit of an idea of the region you're in. As I said before, at the top of the mountain makes a difference to down the bottom of the valley. The soil type that you have, a bit of an estimate of your rainfall and the time of the year that you're mostly getting your rain, because that can make a difference as well. And the type of enterprise you're running. So a bit of a size and scale on which animals give us an indication as well of what's going to work for you. And hopefully we can get back to you quickly with a bit of a recommendation on which species at each time of the year are going to likely work in your area. Especially, well, most areas we would know whether they do, because we've monitored and caught them ourselves in most areas across Australia now. but we can then give you an estimate of how much it might cost to get you some beetles to get some going on your own farm. I think that's about it, Russ. And thank you to everyone for coming this evening. Any other questions, by all means, send them through. Very keen to have feedback. If anyone is interested in doing a more advanced one, as I said, we're going to try and do that over the next couple of weeks. We'll try to run a couple of advanced ones. We might break them into north and south. What do you think, Russ?
Yeah, it's probably more appropriate.
Yeah,
very different. Very different.
Up here in the north, we've got very different things like buffalo fly and so forth. That's also becomes an issue. So we might break into an advanced north and an advanced south to give some more in-depth stuff, and we can take questions beforehand as well, which might help us guide exactly what people need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's always helpful to know what people want to know.
Thank you for your time, everybody. We'll hang on for a few minutes to capture any other things that pop up on there, but have a very good night.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for spending the evening with us.